This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, esteemed guests, welcome to the 8th Annual Irish Studies Lecture here at Senate House. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this evening to hear Professor Joanna Bourke.
Microphone's not working.
Professor Joanna Bourke. Thank you. Sorry. I was saying welcome, friends and colleagues, to tonight's annual lecture in Irish Studies here at Senate House. The series of lectures that are given here are given under the auspices of the Irish Studies Seminar, which operates out of the Institute of English Studies. And I'd like to start by making a few notes of thanks, first of all to the Institute of English Studies and to the School of Advanced Study, which resides here at Senate House, for the support that it gives our seminar and the dozens of seminars that have their home here, and long may they continue to do so. I'd also like to thank the British Association of Irish Studies for its support for the seminar and for tonight's lecture, as well as Canterbury Christchurch University, Goldsmiths, King's College, Queen Mary, all of the University of London, of course, and Liverpool University as well, who have all contributed to tonight's lecture. As I say, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Joanna Bourke. It says something about the prolific and extraordinary range of tonight's speaker that she has one book that is actually just out and another book that is forthcoming within a few months. The first of those books, The Story of Pain from Prayer to Painkillers, is in bookshops right now, so you can rush out and buy it straight away, I'm sure, after hearing tonight's lecture. And Wounding the World, How the Military and War Plague Invade Our Lives, will be coming out later this year. It's useful to have one and then the other to enjoy the pleasure of pain, as it were, and to address the wounding, and to have them in sequence, because that process of exploring and engaging with her work is one which is extremely rewarding and remains a series of journeys that are extraordinary, both in their breadth and in their comprehension of perhaps the most urgent questions of our times. I was thinking about the best way to explain Joanna's work, or to think of a way of encapsulating what it is she does, and it's very difficult because of the range and the ambition of her study. I came up with epic. I think epic is one way of describing her work, both in the sense that it has superb literary quality, in the first instance, its scale, it's the sense in which it tackles enormous subjects and conquers them, because it's fearless and ambitious in tackling these immense questions. And also in the sense that it seeks out and goes on a journey through the darkest aspects of our world and acts as a guide, a secure guide, through those infernos which we all should face, and Joanna's work enables us to face. Joanna began working in Irish studies. Her first book was From Husbandry to Housewifery, which was a history of female labour in rural Ireland in the 19th century. And from that point she has embarked across an extraordinary range of quests, beginning in her analysis of the British working classes in the 19th and 20th centuries in working class cultures in Britain, 1860 to 1960, and then moving forward into her remarkable studies of the cultural history of modern warfare, which is indeed a subject that continues to guide her work and to be a central concern of her investigations. As I mentioned, Wounding the World, how the military and warplay invade our lives seems a particularly pertinent question, especially for those of us with kids who are playing video games or first-person shooters, as Joanna explained to me one day. So, Dismembering the Male and Men's Bodies, Britain and the Great War in 1996, and the prize-winning Intimate History of Killing in 1999, which, as I'm sure you all know, won the Wolfson History Prize, the Frankel Prize, as well as being shortlisted for the W.H. Smith Literary Prize. Those works engage and explore war not just in the sense of the vast political and historical structures which generate conflict, but in the more intimate sense of the people and places that are experienced in those conflicts. And I think it's that capacity to perceive magisterially the overview of history with the very intimate experience of individuals who are going through historical processes, almost like a sort of Tolstoyan capacity to move from the universal right down to the brass tacks of pain, terror, fear, and to know that these abstract things only ever happen in concrete terms to real people. So very much moving forward and continuing in that vein, Fear, A Cultural History in 2005, Rape, A History from 1860 to the Present in 2007, brought home those very large questions into a focus which had never been seen before. It's important to note that Joanna Bourke is not just an erudite and perceptive, inventive scholar, but also a public intellectual who takes those insights and delivers them through popular media, through the press, through her journalistic work, and also through exploring other media for history, such as her triple gold medal winning 10-volume audio history, Eyewitness, A History of 20th Century Britain, which also came out in 2005. So it's that capacity to both write and to explore ideas and the history of ideas, the experience of those apparently abstract things in concrete terms, which enables Joanna to go on and write a book like her last book, What It Means to Be Human, in 2011. That contrast, the ability to find a contrast between, or to actually not find contrast, but to undermine the notion of contrast, to explore the supposed things that identify humanity and find out that what is monstrous and what is human, what is animal, are not actually contained between very clearly defined boundaries, but actually it's the indeterminacy of the borders which is interesting. That capacity, I think, remains part of her epic capacity. Throughout this extraordinary journey that Joanna has taken us on, she has always remained somebody with an interest and an activity within Irish studies. And this evening, as you can see, her subject returns to that first interest, desire and dishonour, heterosexuality in 19th century Ireland. So I'm very pleased to welcome Joanna Bourke tonight.
Well, thank you, Ben, for that exquisite torture. Expectations now have been set so high that there's only failure and disappointment left for us all here for the next 45 minutes. So don't blame me, blame Ben. The day after Valentine's Day, 1865, love was in the air, of course. Catherine Cronin, a young woman with an impeccable reputation, was visiting her sister and brother-in-law, Patrick and Hannah O'Connor, who lived near Kanturk in northwest Cork. This was to be a farewell visit. Basically, Catherine's father had been forced to give up his farm, so she was preparing to immigrate to Queensland. There, in the company of her relatives, the national school teacher, Mr. Ring, and a horse, Catherine met Mortimer Cremen, of a respectable farming family who was also immigrating to Queensland, having inherited some money after his father died. Influenced probably by the season, we are told, Mortimer promised to marry Catherine and to give her a fortune of £250 once they arrived in Queensland. Readers of the Cork Examiner were informed that engagements like this were not especially unusual. After all, it reported, it was a well-known fact that in the country at Strove time, marriages are arranged at the shortest of notice between parties who an hour before had never seen each other. It was a very merry party. They drank whiskey until 6 in the morning. Then Patrick O'Connor and Mr. Ring basically dozed on the settee while Catherine and her sister shared a bed in another room. There was a slight altercation when Mortimer made an attempt on the poor girl's virtue, but he was stopped before any damage could be done, and nothing much more was thought of it. After all, the school teacher later admitted, we all looked upon the two young people as engaged to be married. Furthermore, except for the horse, they had all been drinking very, very heavily. Now, after a few hours, Mr. Ring made his way to the school, and when asked about how drunk he was, and whether this was going to set a bad example for his pupils, he claimed that there was no harm in it, sure I was sober. For young Mortimer, however, setting a bad example was the least of his worries. When sobriety dawned, he denied having promised to wed Catherine and to give her 250 gold guineas. So who was to be believed? Was it to be the chaste Irish woman with her inebriated witnesses, or that young, hapless Irishman? Now, when the case came to court, August 1865, it was a very lively affair, with locals crowding the courtroom, in fact overcrowding the courtroom. Now, these of course were highly staged performances, and Mortimer's counsel seems to have been a great wit. Kanturk was, he said, probably the most litigious little town in Her Majesty's dominions. He then misquoted Sir Walter Scott's line, which goes, love rules the court, the castle and the camp, and men below and saint above, for love is heaven and heaven is love. In Kanturk, he claimed it was more correct to say, law rules the men of Kanturk's famous town. They love to see the judges wig and gown, of chairman and of judge, or of judge, they little stand in awe, for law to them is heaven, and heaven is law. And the courtroom burst into loud, raucous laughter. The schoolteacher, Mr. Ring, should henceforth be called Mr. Wedding Ring, and the horse, who had witnessed the raucous proceedings from inside the court throughout the night, inside the house throughout the night, should be called to give evidence that Mortimer had been a confounded ass in the whole affair. Mortimer was said to have acted like the young man in the old ballad. There was a young man in Ballinacrazy who wanted a wife to make him uneasy, and thus he addressed her with sighing and groanen, "Oh, will you marry me, Miss Kitty Cronin?" In other words, they had all been blind drunk, and the idea that Murty Kremen possessed 250 gold guineas was obviously ludicrous. Why? In all his life, he never had 250 farthings in Kanturk. Now, local custom actually exonerated Mortimer. It turns out that Catherine had actually threatened to prosecute him for attempted rape. This was further grist to the mill for the QC. There was, for a long period, he said, a custom existing in a neighbouring county of ugly old women charging fine young men with rape in order to compel them to marry them. They had improved of this in Kanturk, when it appears that when a girl wanted a man to marry her, he first charges him with trying to rape her, and then brings an action for breach of promise of marriage. The courtroom erupted again in loud laughter, after which the jury found for the plaintiff, but ordered her a derisory £15 damages and costs. Now, this rather muddled story contains elements that appear time and again in encounters between heterosexual young men and women in Ireland from the 1840s to the 1910s. And some of these elements, of course, are very familiar to us all here. There's land crisis. Catherine was immigrating, of course, because of a crisis in her family farm, and Mortimer's family, too, were dispersing after the death of the father and the inheritance of a farm by a brother. Tumultuous marriage patterns, she didn't have a dowry, immigration, and the excessive indulgence in whiskey. But I'd like to suggest that there are other slightly less familiar aspects to this story. Bawdy sexual humour in very public places and reported in great detail in the newspapers that kind of seems a little out of place in the land of priests of the 1860s. Impulsive declarations of love and desire and desperation. Attempted rape and assertions that rape accusations were a common precursor to marriage. And these, I think, are what interests me, the fleshy practices of the 19th century body, Irish body, in all its concupiscence, fluidity, tumescence, and detumescent glory. Instead of the rather over-determined structural factors involving land, politics, and modernisation, might it actually be productive to turn to the ways in which desire was inflected through much more local temporal rhythms, such as spring, which readers of the Freeman Journal in this period were told causes the awakening of life and sexual activity. The harvest, during which young men and women mingled in the fields, often well into the night. Valentine's Day, which, according to reports in the 1870s, was becoming increasingly popular, with shops boasting a vast array of love cards to suit all classes, which could be ordered by mail for rural people. The much lauded and grossly exaggerated Irish Puritanism, with its exquisitely sensitive G spot, that is Irish guilt spot, sits uneasily alongside evidence of crowded courtrooms where lush stories were told of kissings and cuddlings, of husbands buggering wives in the marital bed, and of the dark dishonour of rape, all told amidst roars of laughter. Humour, it seems, providing a legitimate way of translating what was done into something that could actually be spoken about. So this paper I'm giving you today is part of a much broader work I'm doing on 19th and early 20th century Irish sexuality, asking, has Irish exceptionalism been taken much too far? How did the Irish imagine, practice, and communicate sexual desire? Obviously, bodily performances and social practices of masculinity, femininity, romance, marital relations, corporeal pleasure, sexual violence, etc., were subject to variations according to region, time period, class, religion, gender, generation, stage of life, and so on and so on. Who was actually involved in constituting particular Irish men and women as sexual subjects? What forms did sexual knowledge take when it appeared in public spheres? What could be spoken about and what indeed was censored? Importantly, deliberate acts of silencing were, of course, in their own way, a form of communication, purposefully inciting imagination as opposed to closing it down. For example, when journalists, as they often did, described events as too disgusting to report or of a most revolting character entirely unfit for publication, that was the case of England, of course, between a husband and wife. Imaginations, in fact, were given free rein. So in other words, repression and expression were complementary, a sort of feeding frenzy growing fat off each other. But first, what do we already know? There is, of course, now a very vast and very, very sophisticated literature focusing on gender in Ireland, and indeed there's some people in this room with examples of some of that really sophisticated material. There's also some very new work that theorises sexuality in Ireland, including some real insights by the historian of homosexuality, Sean Brady, who's recently turned to exploring masculinity in Northern Ireland much more generally. But if we focus only on issues of Irish sexuality, historical investigations really have proceeded in three broad waves. Characterised, not totally happily, but characterised as anecdotal, demographic, and constructionist. The first dominated by Ken Connell, K.H. Connell, in a corpus of work that dates from the late 1950s, but continues to be cited today with an extraordinary lack of critical investigation. According to Connell, marriage gratified only incidentally a couple's sexuality, their desire for companionship or for children. It was more conspicuously an economic rather than a biological institution. Marriage was likely to be contemplated not when a man needed a wife, but when the land needed a woman. Okay, well, no one questions, no one who studies Irish peasant societies, or indeed any other society, doubts that economic decisions are important in the timing of marriage, especially, of course, in societies dependent on the labour of family members. And I think that's it's a rather banal observation. This is also not to dispute the fact that there were economic negotiations over marriage, especially over the dowry or fortune. And there's tens of hundreds of examples in the archives where you get young men bursting into tears when their fathers refuse to consent to their marriage until the beloved one's father forks out more dosh, more money. Or accounts of the Glenawilly Decree, said to be very prevalent, especially in Donegal. This is where a bridegroom, if a bridegroom, quote, imagines the dowry he has received is inadequate, he or an accomplice steals some property, a horse, for example, from the father-in-law, and only returns it if a certain amount of money is paid. No one also doubts that changes in Irish economic life since the famine gave increased prominence to the economic in decision-making, particularly in discouraging marriage and delaying its occurrence. But of course, that is all a far cry from arguing that it was the ploughshare that cut the cloth of matrimonial bonds. But I think the real problem in this kind of anecdotal approach is its curious lack of interest in narrative context. An example I'm going to give is the way they use proverbs. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I have read historians quoting Robert Lynn's proverb published in Home Life in Ireland, 1909, which says, "It is unlucky to marry for love." Ignoring, of course, that on the same page, in a footnote, there is another proverb exhorting people to marry for love and induster for riches. Witty quips from folklorists and ethnologists not only become mirrors of reality, but are drawn almost randomly in time. So, for example, analyses of Ireland in the 1860s routinely cite from an 1830s travelogue and a 1950s anthropological text. The political function of commentary is also ignored. For example, when Connell quotes B.N. Hedderman's Glimpses of My Life in Arran, 1917, saying that the emotions of love are almost unknown, he ignores the fact that Hedderman was really making an argument about modernity and Irish so-called backwardness. It's one thing to quote Michael McDonough's in Irish Life and Character, 1899, when he reported that the average peasant takes unto himself a mate with as clear a head, as placid a heart, and as steady a nerve as if he were buying a cow in Ballinacrazy fair. It's quite another thing, of course, to forget to mention that this fair was rife with unclear heads and unsteady hearts. Then there is the problem of what might be characterized as a sort of island mentality, which no one in this room is guilty of, I'm sure. In other words, it's not uncommon to read accounts of Irish exceptionalism which don't bother to investigate whether identical practices and narratives existed elsewhere. For example, historians have found evidence for the sexual repression of Irish women under Catholicism in the Freeman's Journal. For example, they quote 1990 Freeman's Journal, which goes, "In Ireland, purity is so highly esteemed that the lapse from purity is the more pitilessly punished. No excuse is found for her, she can find none for herself." And of course, the obvious problem here is that identical rhetoric appears in the Leicester Chronicle, the Manchester Times, the Bath Review, or any number of English newspapers of the period. Now, the second approach to Irish sexuality and marriage serves, I guess, a firm backhand to the anecdotal and has, as a consequence, been exceptionally productive. In contrast to the amusing anecdotal ejaculations, this literature is characterized by its rigor, quantitative reserve, and analytical sophistication. These historians, demographers, and social scientists approach heterosexuality through institutional practices, especially the formal acts that constitute family formation. How many men and women married? At what ages? Did family adhere to the STEM model or not? Was the famine a watershed in marital practices? Most notably, they have used statistics about marriage patterns to show that marriage in Ireland underwent some dramatic transformations in the long 19th century. Worshipping precision over the broad picture and fond of degrees of subtlety that can seem finicky to outsiders, these scholars twiddled endlessly with statistics in order to refine temporal and regional variations. Now, I really hate to generalize about the work of scholars who are so opposed to generalization, but risking their wrath, they have, I think, proven conclusively that 19th and early 20th century Irish men and women married less and later, and their research, I think, has illuminated worlds of interest. The third wave is far too impatient to be seduced by anecdote alone and too eclectic to successfully woo the cleometricians. They have a voracious appetite for narrative as well as notations, and preoccupy themselves with debates about power relations, agency, networks, while throwing themselves into the stew of human experience as it is incompletely logged in the archive. The last decade and a half has been, I think, a very fruitful one for this group of academics. They have, however, it has to be admitted, had to be brave, in part because they have incited the fury of some nationalist and religious forces. I'm just going to give one example here. Tom Inglis called a ruckus when he published Lessons in Irish Sexuality in 1999. Danny Desmond reviewed the book, and he was appalled by the suggestion that everything from agrarian conflicts to social drinking culture and alcoholism were due to the sexual repression of the Irish people. One would be forgiven, this reviewer wrote, for thinking that our ancestors and parents were starved of sex, libidinous pressure cookers bursting out frequently across the landscape of Irish history. Strange mixed metaphor there. But anyway, Desmond attacked English for his shocking inability to present the depths and beauty of the Catholic understanding of repentance, human sexuality, and the liberating mercy of God. Desmond said that he found the book insulting, disrespectful to my heritage and beliefs, and no addition to Irish academic life or scientific inquiry. I told him. Desmond was particularly aggrieved by the so-called repression hypothesis, which has been espoused by a vast number of Irish historians of Irish sexuality, I should say. At its basis is the view that post-famine Ireland can be characterised by the repression of everything good, all good, dirty fun. For example, Brendan Walsh commented on the lack of enthusiasm for marriage and sexual activity and claimed that the natural propensity for what Knowles has called passion between the sexes has existed throughout the world, but not in Ireland. Writing in 2008, Carl Salazar claimed that Ireland was a sexually inhibited culture, at least up into the mid-20th century. In Moral Monopoly, Inglis insisted that in pubs throughout Ireland, men displaced their sexual frustration through a repetitive, compulsive pattern of drinking. The fearness of politics in Ireland was an outlet for frustrated men. Historian David Fitzpatrick, always good for a witty turn of phrase, went so far as to say that if the Irish were repressed, they were too effectively repressed to exhibit the fact, or even themselves. The repression hypothesis posits that enforced chastity, used in that very narrow demographic sense, led Irishmen to find compensation in religion, drink, and political violence, and led Irish women, whose libidious desires are assumed to be less so, into contemplation of the Holy Virgin. Now, the problems, of course, are legion. For many historians, appealing to shared psychological traits as historical explanation is in itself dodgy. The repression debates are infused with assumptions about a natural sex drive, which in heterosexual couples culminates in marriage, followed by interpersonal genital practices that allow for the possibility, at least, of a scalding heir. It posits a hydraulic view of sex as a biologically fixed drive that stands in opposition to society. At the very least, I think, Foucault's critique remains valid, even if it is rather passé now. These debates also espouse an extraordinarily narrow range, or narrow definition of the sexual. And there's a very important normative assumption behind much of this historiography, insisting on one particular kind of sexuality. The modern kind is the kind to which the Irish ought to have been moving towards. In many cases, sexual is defined according to the institutional practices of marriage. Without marriage, there is chastity. Chastity equals sexual disgruntlement. Data on illegitimacy is profited, but the full extent of the problems with those statistics and why they might be even more problematic in Ireland than anywhere else is relegated to a footnote. More to the point, I don't think I need to remind our distinguished audience today that there are an abundant range of sexual practices that don't require certification by a priest or cleric, nor genital penetration, nor even the corporeal trace of another human being to be entirely, intensely satisfying. Importantly, I think, though, we actually can find evidence of such practices in the archive. We can get hints of what is allowed by hearing what is prohibited. Example, a man who kissed and embraced a woman to whom he was not promised in marriage was publicly rebuked for taking all the privileges of an engaged man, thus suggesting that betrothed couples were allowed to kiss and embrace. And this indeed was why little fuss was made about the opening story when Mortimer made an attempt on the poor girl's virtue. As the schoolteacher said, we all looked upon them as engaged to be married. Interpersonal disputes tell us where the boundaries for sexual encounters became fuzzy. There's extensive discussion, for example, of the boundaries between skylarking and being offensive, that are debated in vivid detail in courtrooms and noisily commented on by local witnesses. Local people, villagers speculated earnestly over who kissed whom, who initiated the kiss. They burst into laughter when told that a young man asked a woman if she would marry him, and the woman responded by asking him if he would marry her. And speculating over the low illegitimacy rates, it is interesting to observe that there seems to have been widespread agreement amongst the rural Irish that if a man seduced a woman, then he would naturally marry her. And this was particularly true if sexual intercourse had occurred over a long period of time, or if both families were considered respectable. For instance, it was greatly in her favour, 1893 case, that a mother could swear that, but there is never a policeman near our house, unless they come to take the census. Men were expected to do what an honest man would have done, thus offering to make an honest woman of her. There was, in fact, considerable sympathy for the dishonoured woman, even if she had engaged in sexual intercourse multitude times with the defendant and indeed with other men. And I've got lots and lots of evidence for this, but I'll just give you one. In the words of 1 QC 1861, although Eliza Searle had been accused of several acts of depravity since the first one with a young man called Quinn, every time she fell, the act may be traced to the original act of seduction by him, and instead of mitigating, it ought to aggravate the damages. Nay, more, the man who commits the act by which a girl is brought from the paths of virtue is responsible for every evil that she does afterwards. And locals in the courtroom burst into a round of applause. It is simply not the case, as the author of Women and Sexuality in 19th-Century Ireland claimed, that not only were women responsible for their own shortcomings, they were also responsible for the shortcomings of their menfolk. Indeed, there are many, many cases of seduction where the argument goes in precisely the opposite direction. Imagination is also social practice. Young Irish men and women were as aware as others of the pleasures and dangers of onanism and self-abuse. Religious spokesmen from all denominations shrilly condemned it, not because it was unimportant, but because it was very important indeed. Now, of course, admit, there are no historical traces that show where hands wandered after hours, but the front pages of newspapers such as the Dublin Evening Mail and the Freeman's Journal featured the vice, which they named thus, on their front pages, suggesting that it was well known, if not an active practice. By publicly proclaiming the existence of this vice, it was admitted into the sensibilities of the merely curious, as well as those enslaved to the vice. Perhaps ironically, one of the best places to explore sexual activity that took place in Irish Tatterfields or behind drawn curtains is to eavesdrop on priests and clerics. It's immediately clear is that these men were increasingly intervening in the sexual and marital practices. This is really, really striking, particularly in the 1860s, as they sought great passion to protect the sacramental nature of marriage in the face of increasing interventions by secular forces and allegations towards the Catholics that the Catholic ceremonies were irregular. These complaints came to the fore in two contexts. First was claims that Catholic priests were marrying men in the dock. Now, I've written about this elsewhere, so I'll just very quickly skim over it here, but it relates to sectarian complaints that Irish priests were colluding with Irish women who swear a rape against the father of their illegitimate children. Accused men would ask the priest to marry them to the aggrieved women. In the words of the Reverend Beresford Johnson, it was as common for a woman to act so, that is swear a rape, to forced marriage, it is as common for a woman to act so as for the sun to shine. and he recollected many instances where marriage had in consequence actually taken place. The accusation that in order to compel a man to marry them, Irish women frequently charged them with the commission of this crime, so that the husband is led to the church with a halter around his neck, was even mentioned in the House of Commons. And I'm just going to give you one very, very quick example of this, and it's an example which it happens quite frequently. I've got lots of examples of this, of a prosecutrix who stood up in court to tell the judge that she declined to prosecute a man for rape since she had subsequently married him. When the judge said, "I cannot examine a wife against her husband," the Crown Counsel responded that these rape cases are very serious matters and they are very prevalent, and strong measures must be resorted to prevent their so frequent occurrence. But the judge was not convinced. He responded, "I don't think that they are rape cases at all. They are cases where girls swear information for the purpose of getting husbands, and in my opinion should be discouraged instead of encouraged. They are Kerry rapes, but I don't think they could be as considered as rapes elsewhere." So the alleged propensity of Irish women, especially in the west of Ireland, to swear rape in order to stronghold a man into marrying them continued to be made well into the mid-19th century. The second context was about procedures. 1860s. There was grave concern within the established church about, this is their spelling, not mine, clandestinity and irregularity of marriages conducted by Roman Catholic priests. The problem of clandestinity, various bishops responded, had ceased with the Synod of Thurles of 1850, which decreed that Catholic marriages could only be celebrated inside churches. But there were three remaining problems. First, parish priests were not correctly registering marriages. Second, they faced the very real threat that the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 would be applied to be extended to Ireland. But even if they managed to fight that off, they were concerned that contagion was inevitable. As the Right Reverend William O'Keefe, Roman Catholic Bishop of Queenstown, said, divorced people have come and still will come to Ireland. And third, there was the threat of civil marriage contracts. Now, what these debates in the 1860s reveal, however, is just how far Irish sexual practices deviated from the pious ideal. When Catholic representatives pleaded with their UK counterparts to respect the traditional morality of Irish women and men, they were not describing affairs in Ireland, but were engaged in an attempt to construct a new Irish morality, a Catholic nation. In other words, the much repeated declarations about chaste Irish women were what we might today call speech acts. By proclaiming the Irish as chaste and different from the English, priests were attempting to create a particular separate Irish subject rather than simply reporting on a subject identity. The famed Irish purity was a chimera. This was even admitted by priests themselves. For example, they were aware that, in fact, the Irish poor were not getting married. When the Right Reverend Bishop Mority tried to convince the commissioners on the laws of marriage that the new system of registering marriage was operating smoothly in Ireland, he was actually forced in the end to admit that the very poor people who have no inheritance to leave their children do not feel the need to marry. He noted that the poor here have very little interest in getting their marriages registered, and the only circumstance which induced their anxiety to get their marriages registered is the demand for certificates in consequence of the American War. In other words, poor couples registering their marriages not for moral or religious reasons, but because being able to show that they were married would give their men an exemption from military service and provide women, their wives, widows, with pensions and allowances. Clergy of all religions and denominations also admitted to crafty practices in order to cover up immoral behaviour in their areas. They kept separate marriage registers and conducted certain marriage ceremonies in private in the cases of people who had had extramarital intercourse. Even the Lord Bishop of Derry, who led the established church and was extremely critical of Catholic priests, who he claimed conduct marriages at all times and places, believed that there were occasions when discretion required a clergyman to keep a separate marriage register. He gave 2 examples. First was when a man and woman who had been living in concubinage and have a natural reluctance to a public marriage. The second was when a man on his deathbed was desirous of making reparation to the women with whom he has illegally lived. In such instances, clergy and priests actually agreed. As a Catholic bishop testified, where the 2 people to be married had been living together and supposed by all in the neighbourhood to be married, the priest should register the marriage, but in a private and separate register. The influence of the Catholic Church on sexuality can also be judged by the number of times young Irish women in particular turned to parish priests for help in enabling them to marry. And I've already mentioned this briefly in the context of rape, but it also applies to consensual relationships. So there are a lot of cases where these cases get to court, and basically they explain that they didn't want it to go that far, but they had reported it to the priest, and it had all exploded on them. Less commonly, men also used the authority of the church, as in the case of prolonged anal intercourse that a husband subjected his wife to in 1873, where we are told that she only consented because she was, in her words, green. Readers of a number of Irish, national and regional newspapers were told in lurid detail how he quoted the scripture in support of his act and told her it was her duty as a wife. And indeed, there is also evidence that parish priests might be willing to override paternal authority in particular circumstances. This was what the Right Reverend Bishop Mority argued when he admitted that although it was a very grievous wrong to marry a person under the age of consent without first getting approval of the parents, there were times when he said he did so. In his words, if I found, for instance, that a young person had been seduced and that she was in imminent danger of losing her character, and if she confided such secret to me or to a parish clergyman, I would do all in my power to obtain the father's consent to the marriage, but if he refused, I would allow the marriage to go ahead without the parents' consent. And he said it would be particularly likely to do this, in other words, override parental consent, if there would be no consequence as to property or fortune, where they have nothing to lose but their character. It must be obvious these debates were all part of a struggle for the souls of parishioners, and priests dealt discreetly with concubinage and illegitimacies because they were a regular event in local life. But just before I conclude, I want to just briefly draw attention to a comment I made earlier about speech acts or performativity. That is, rhetoric that seeks to create rather than describe a particular Irish subject identity. After all, boasting about the chastity and domestic morality of Irish women was a national preoccupation, and it was infused through and through with politics of nation building. Irish women were conceived of in opposition to English ones, and occasionally French and American. It was reported to be very credible to the country that moral Ireland was set up against an immoral England. Newspapers such as the Cork Examiner even had a dedicated column sarcastically entitled Moral England to thump out the comparisons. The assertion of heterosexual norms played a major role in such political struggles. There's also, you can see, major Scottish and English and Scottish particularly backlash against such characterizations. So newspapers as different as the London Standard, the Hampshire Observer, the Yorkshire Gazette, all repeated word for word the comment that, quote, in the degree of depravity, the women of Ireland are temperate, while those of England and Scotland are at blood heat. But this was to pronounce a foul and unnatural stigma upon the female character of England. Irish heterosexual practices were posited as yet another reason why they could not ungovern themselves. And in fact, what's really interesting, I think, is that contradictory positions could be held. In other words, it was argued both that the Irish could not be given more political power because they were sexually moral, and that they couldn't be given this because they were sexually immoral. And I'll just take one example, illustration of each of these. First argument, report in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, 1880, said, "We have no wish to detract from the superior behaviour of the Irish in sexual relations," adding, however, that Irish morality was secured at the expense of living like goats and practicing murder against landlords. Sort of an early version of the repression hypothesis there. Second argument, again, there's lots of examples of this, the argument that immorality made them unfit. So morality makes them unfit, immorality also does. Example would be reportage of the Carden, the very famous 1854 abduction case involving John Carden. Times reported that at Carden's trial, the ladies of Tipperary waved their handkerchiefs from the galley and cheered the ungentle knight, whose only fault was the excessive ardour of his love. It is clear that there is at least one county in Ireland in which even rape can be reproduced without unqualified horror. So in other words, the alleged immorality of Tipperary ladies, at least, reflection on the people who needed the governance of a more mature, enlightened power. Just to conclude, my emphasis today, of course, has been on bodies, love, desire, and should not blind us to, of course, sexual and gendered violence, which also took place in the Irish Tatterfields and pubs, and which I've written about elsewhere. I mean, these courtrooms are also full of women being murdered for such commonplace things as putting lemonade in a spirit glass, a husband being given a cup of tea in the eye for daring to suggest that his name should be painted over the door of their small shop rather than hers, cases of jealousy in which women threw a carom of turf at each other, a husband tearing the clothes off his wife and throwing her out of the house so he could live with beggar woman Mary Dunn. Crowds in courtrooms laughed uproariously when a man accused of attacking a stranger pleaded, "Please, sir, I was drunk and I thought I was beating my wife." My point, however, is that we need to look beyond regulation and surveillance to see how heterosexuality in Ireland was constituted through a range of practices of activation and disavowal, play as well as containment, indulgent rituals as well as penitent ones. It has been said by some historians of Irish sexuality that what differentiated Irish sexuality with the rest of Victorian UK was the absence of resistant discourses and subaltern voices. But actually, I think that we can hear such voices, played out especially in the highly staged, theatrically driven courtrooms, where Irish women in particular proved very good at talking back to judges, as in the woman who gesticulated in a violent manner, clasping her hands and putting her arms akimbo when her rape accusation was minimised, or where a woman like Roseanne Mulligan accused counsel of acting very shabbily. "It's revenge I want, and will have it for the injury that hath been done me." When she was accused of being a liar and a prostitute, she kept repeating, I will tie your hair, I will have vengeance." In such instances, I think we can get some hints about the proliferation of discourses on sexuality, not a repression. I'm not arguing that there was this dramatic revolution, but I do think that we can trace in the public record an increased talk of love and spring and St. Valentine's Day. Yes, there was talk of loveless matches, but they in fact were considered aberrations rather than the norm. Indeed, Irish commentators at the time were struck not by the repression of feelings, but the opposite. Thus, 1875, Freeman's Journal reported that Valentine's Day was extremely popular. We all know, it reported, that whether it marks our civilization or otherwise, the 19th century is unused to suppressing its feelings, and when those feelings take the all-absorbing form of love, St. Valentine's Day and its attendant privileges are looked forward to by thousands. So to tell the story of heterosexual love in Ireland, we need to pay attention to what people found ludicrous, such as the idea of a married woman of a severe and forbidding aspect consorting in the fields with a young man. We also need to, I suggest, map a history of everyday practices. Things like declension. He called me Kate. He was getting warm. The giving of handkerchiefs. Being praised for having fine lips and pretty black eyes. And being invited down to the baths. And he told me he would bring something very handsome with him in his pocket. Wives who were said to read, she read a poem of Byron's in order to excite my affection, but then refused to allow him to embrace her. Sexual encounters that took place as a David band was playing up and down the road. And of course, the dirty pleasures of the Royal Marine Hotel in Bray, a hotel said to be as well known as Buckingham Palace in England. In other words, we need to pay attention to those things that made men and women in Ballinacrazy feel uneasy. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna, for such an engaging lecture. Joanna's kindly offered to answer questions, so I'd like to open the floor to you. It's a long room, so if you wouldn't mind standing, please. Yes.
I wondered about dancing at the crossroads, which in my family stories figures quite a lot as a place for lively interaction between the sexes. And when my great-grandmother, Ellen Silk, who immigrated in 1866 to New Zealand, there were a couple of years before that, when the man she was promised to had gone to New Zealand already, and she regarded herself as engaged and no longer went to the crossroad dances.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, dancing at the crossroads comes up time and time. And I should say, the real source for these kinds of things, because it's very, very difficult to get this kind of information, the real source is actually courtrooms where there is some problem happening. And what's interesting for me is not so much what the problem itself is, whether it's rape, sexual violence, whether it's a dispute over land, but the incidentals. And dancing at the crossroads comes up time and time as one of those incidentals. So when they're trying to establish whether someone had a relationship or not, they said, I first met at the crossroads, I first met at these dances. And actually, from what they are saying, a vast amount of sexualized activity was taking place at these dances. And as you say, once someone seemed to be engaged to be married, or promised in marriage, I should say, that really stopped. They stopped doing that. The other interesting thing is when the word promised to be married and engaged to be married changes. In the earlier stuff, it's all promised to be married. And when love increasingly is entering the public domain, it's increasingly engaged to be married, which I think is another interesting aspect to that, footnote to that.
Yes.
As you know, I'm not a 19th centuryist, it's mainly 18th century I've been working on. I'm interested in abductions, and they were very common, obviously, in the 18th century. And round about the 70s, 80s or 90s, there's a case where one of the judges actually executed 2 young men who'd taken 2 young women. And before that, it had just been sort of an acceptable thing for them to abduct a girl and to marry them. And instead of carrying marriages, it was mainly abductions to get land. And they'd be forced to marry then the person who abducted them. And I'm wondering how common was that into the 19th century?
Yeah, I've actually I've done quite a lot of work on that. It's actually quite common well into the mid-19th century, very much into it. Where the difference is, there seem to be, at least in the period I'm dealing with, which is post-famine, there seem to be really 2 different models of abduction in the first half up into the 1860s. The first is the rape. thing, which you mentioned, which is it's a way of forcing a marriage for land reasons or things like that. Sorry, there's actually three. The second, though, is it's a form of stalking. So the case I mentioned here, John Carden, actually in today's language, we would not call that attempted abduction. We would actually call that we would actually call it stalking type thing. The third, though, which is increasing in the period, again up until the 1860s, is women colluding in their own abduction in order to force the parents to marry, to consent to a marriage. And again, this whole increase in this discourse of love, I think, is related to that. So women themselves are actually standing up in court and saying, actually, this is not abduction. I consented. I wanted to go. My parents wouldn't give consent for that, and this was my way of doing it. And again, the responses of the crowds in these courtrooms, because they're always, as far as I can tell, crowded. And the response of the crowds in the courtrooms is very, very favourable to this. And there's one case which was actually very late. I think it's the latest I've got, which is actually in 1871. But that's it. I've only got one that late. But in that case, actually, the case went against the young couple, and there was almost a riot in the courtroom.
There's a question here. Right.
Thanks, Joanna. I really admired the way that you dealt with that evidence, because it seems to me when you're dealing with the history of sexuality, and this is true of one of the most prominent books on sexuality, history of, that by restricting oneself necessarily to court cases, you're restricting yourself to usually non-consensual sex, and to disagreement, and to aggression. And to find the history of consensual sex is just extremely difficult. And the only place you'll find it is probably in letters and diaries, where it is. And it seems to me that in the period you're talking about, it would be much less likely to find that. In the early 20th century, and one thinks at random of James Joyce's letters to Nora, or though I know you're dealing with heterosexuality, Dr. Caseman's diary. And there you hear a different kind of voice and a different kind of relaying of experience. Having looked a bit at sexual activity in that area, I've been surprised actually how frank diaries and letters are, especially diaries that record conversations about sex between women. Wasn't Jacob's diary, but is there any way in which in your more tricky period, the 1860s and 70s, you can approach the private voices that record consensual sex that doesn't end up in the courts?
As you say, there are so few letters and diaries that, in the period I'm dealing with, that actually record those things. And I'm not so much interested, this is going to really upset you, in the big names like Joyce. I want to know what, what your average peasant is thinking and doing. And if that's the aim, really, the only way that I can do that on a large scale is through these court cases. But it's not court cases that, I'm not, at least in this paper, I'm not interested in the conflict. These court cases actually give a huge amount of evidence about everyday activities, consensual activities. So, when you read them, I'm also interested in the times when both sides agree that this was what happened and he gave her this and she gave him that and they kissed and they did this. I'm interested in that bit as opposed to the bits where they start disagreeing, which is saying, it was rape or something like that. And if we want to get a lot of people, if we want to know the experience of a lot of people, that's really, I think, the only way that I found to do it. And if there is any other way, I'd be really, really grateful. Of course, there are other ways to do it, and that is the popularity of certain kinds of Valentines is another way. Some Valentine cards were much more popular than others. There's price issues, there's all those sorts of issues, but there are those kinds of ways that we can do it. And, yeah, but it is through that reading of consent in what are fundamentally non-consensual legal cases.
Joanna, I like your speech act argument very much, and I was just wondering if you ever get evidence from priests off stage, priests saying, between themselves, doesn't matter what you tell these people, they're incorrigible. And that's partly because in the 18th century, priests are off the stage all the time because they're not allowed to be on it. So when they write to Rome, they complain of sexual irregularities constantly. And the other question is, with travellers to Ireland, who often comment on the virtue of the Irish, they could be, of course, swallowing what they're being told. But similarly, I wonder whether they ever say, actually the priests say the Irish are chaste, but it's not true.
Yeah, they say that a lot. Travellers are really interesting. They do say that they do make a distinction between what they are being told and indeed their own sexual encounters in Ireland. So I think you're very right there. The offstage thing, I just haven't done that research yet. There is material, but I haven't actually done that yet. But I fully intend to, because that's the material we need. But that said, even on stage, they are admitting to all of this. The 1860s Commission on Marriage, they are admitting to it a lot of things that go against the official policy, and I find that, or the official line, I should say, and I find that really, really interesting. They're being pushed on us all the time by the commissioners. The Mority quotes that I gave, I have to admit, he is the most blunt about the extent of immorality in Ireland, but he had to be pushed there for a while, and then all of a sudden it all comes out that yes, there is all these problems, yes, we are conducting irregular marriages, yes, we are doing this. So even on stage, in other words, we've got a lot of information, but yes, I need to find more, yeah. And I will.
Thank you. This does seem to me to be an awful lot about Irish exceptionalism, as if Ireland is culturally so incredibly different from anywhere else, where when I look at court records in Britain, what they're doing is the barristers are constantly comparing a case to some kind of classical mythology or to what happens in other countries or what happens in the Bible. And they're always looking for that precedent. In these Irish cases you're talking about, they seem to be saying, well, this is what we do in Ireland.
Yeah, I'm really struck by the Irish historiography, which is all about exceptionalism. Nearly all. There are a couple of exceptions, but it's that's the line. And most, and I don't believe it at all. The cases that I'm reading, whenever I get a case in the Irish, I look for a similar one in the British newspapers. And in most cases, I can find an equivalent relatively quickly. There's a book written by Connolly, came out, called Melancholic Accidents, which makes the strongest argument for exceptionality in terms of rape and murder in Ireland. And every single case that she makes is wrong and can be easily shown to be wrong. There is actually one area where I do think there's some exceptionality in Ireland, and it actually surprised me, because if there is any trend, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but if there is any trend, I actually think the Irish newspapers are more lurid and go into more detail about sexual activity than the equivalent reports certainly in England. I don't want to push that too strongly, but there's been some cases where it's been reported in both countries, either identical cases or very, very similar cases, and if you look at them, if anything, it's more explicitly sexualized in the Irish papers, particularly ones like Cork, Examiner, and Tipperary Record.
I'm not saying that there is something rather extraordinary about Ireland, in that it's a continually falling population in the 19th century. There's a higher ratio of priest to people all through the century, increasing. I think Hoppen gives a figure of one priest for every 2,700, and by the end of the 19th century it's one per 1,000 or something like this. In other words, there's a much greater policing of the public sphere in Ireland than there is in a more secularized state like England. And what about all the wake amusements which used to be in the pre-famine Ireland, which were so involved with various forms of sexual norms that wouldn't be acceptable later on. After the arrival of Bishop Cullen, most of these are stamped out. And even the crossroads dancing, which is publicly policed in a way by the church, is not something in the K.H. Connell argument after all.
Okay. No. in my view. Firstly, sorry, I didn't make myself clear a few minutes ago. I'm not arguing against Irish exceptionalism in all instances. I'm arguing in terms of sexuality. Because clearly Ireland is very different in terms of marriage practices. I mean, I think the demographers, as I hope I made very clear, and the statistical evidence, I think, is irrefutable there. I also agree with them completely about immigration and that as some kind of safety valve. So I'm only making an argument against exceptionalism in terms of sexual practices. You talk about priests, I agree. As I spoke a lot myself about the role of the Catholic Church. My argument here is that exceptional to what? And I don't think it's as exceptional if you're comparing it with similar societies in, for example, rural England. And certainly in terms of public reportage of sexual activity, that's what we're really talking about here. Actually, I don't think it's exceptional. So I think we have to be really careful. And the same thing, amusements, I agree completely. Also, in terms of the increasing importance of religion, I also agree completely, not only in terms of Cullen's reforms, but also Protestant Ireland. If you read the Commission on Marriage, very, very similar concerns are being made by Protestant clerics in this period, and they are also trying to take more power over marriage and sexuality into their own hands. So I think it's actually both. I think it's a two-sided thing.
There's a question here.
It's not a question, just a comment. That when I wrote in the States, many of the publishing firms were owned by the Irish, and they did encourage and pander to sensationalism. It's true. Yeah, not all, but some.
One last question.
Thank you, Joanna. I'm familiar with the work of Maria Luddy, but I'm wondering if you could say something a little bit about how prostitution would figure under desire and dishonour in your argument.
I'm going to give you the honest answer. I think Maria Luddy's work is fantastic, and I just think she's done it. I really like her work very, very strongly, and I appreciate what I do like about her work is that she also undercuts this notion that that there wasn't much, undercuts this notion that prostitutes were not so important in Ireland, and which she conclusively shows is not the case. I think the only area where we do disagree, and I would hate to really argue with her because I think she's fantastic, but I do think that she slightly exaggerates the extent to which a lot of these women were outcasts. I think that there is a much more fluid group of women who work as prostitutes, who go in and out of prostitution, than her sources give her access to. And I suspect it is about the different sources that she is using. She's really looking at a particular kind of prostitute. So that's, I think, where we would probably disagree. But otherwise, I haven't got much to say on prostitutes that she hasn't said very well.
Thank you for being such a fantastic audience. I'd just like to take a moment to remind you about our next events. Our annual symposium is on Wednesday, the 25th of June. It's on dealing with the past in Northern Ireland. There are still places available, so if you'd like more information, you can find Ian McBride or Simon Prince after the lecture. I'd also like to remind you about our regular seminar series, which is held here in the Senate House in term time on the first Friday of the month. And you'll be able to find information about next year's seminars on the Institute of English Studies website in the coming months. But we look forward to continuing the conversation over our drink reception, very kindly sponsored by the Irish Embassy. Please thank you in joining me to thank, sorry, please join me in thanking Joanna.